From the kitchen of the cabin and around the world, this is Voices from the Solitude, podcast about the coronavirus and gaming. In this episode, I talked to journalist Owen Duffy about a variety of topics. So I'm here today with Owen Duffy, writer for The Guardian, creator of the board game book and all-round commentator on board games. So I guess to begin, how are you dealing with the lockdown and what's the situation in Scotland?
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. We've got a lockdown just as we've had in the rest of the UK. I would say that the Scottish government has been a lot clearer on its advice to people. There hasn't been any of the kind of dialing back of the stay-in advice. And just like Boris Johnson, we've had a high-ranking government advisor go off on a trip to a second family home, but they at least had the decency to resign.
And I mean, do you think... I mean, I always get the impression that Scotland has basically, over the last kind of 20 years, become a socialist paradise, with sort of free university and all of that sort of stuff. Do you think... So I guess my question is there a sense that because of sort of Scotland's left-wing bona fides that they're not doing the same thing as Johnson's government? Or is there a feeling that the Scottish government always has to stand opposed to the English one?
I think it's less a case of a left-right divide on this issue than a sort of sensible grown-up approach and a completely incompetent one, to be honest. I think that in a lot of ways, the Scottish government. I mean, I'm not an SNP supporter. I'm a member of another party, but I think that Nicola Sturgeon has kind of emerged as the adult in the room over the last few years. I think that the Westminster government has just been this sort of den of kind of personal aggrandizement and kind of self-interested chancers, and I think that the Scottish government, by comparison, just seems to do the day job a lot more diligently and competently, and without all this sort of, I look at the Tory party and it's basically just all these kind of media posturing, kind of privileged people who are in positions that they don't deserve to be in and have absolutely no kind of competence at, from Boris Johnson to Michael Gove, to, David Cameron. All of them are just these just privileged, entitled, rich kids who've grown up into positions of power that they're completely unsuited for, and I think that we're seeing the results of that now.
I mean,
so this got political quickly, didn't it, Ben?
It certainly did. But it seems to me it's very interesting that it seems to me, because I'm a natural Labour supporter, and I'm of course at the moment pinning all my hopes on Keir Starmer. He seems sensible, but I mean, in terms of self-aggrandizement and sort of wrong-headedness, I've never seen a more sort of wrong-headed decision than Jeremy Corbyn to take Britain into the last general election. I think a large part of Boris Johnson's majority is down to Corbyn's refusal to step down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of strange. There's, in terms of putting public utilities in public hands, there's a lot of that sort of Labour left thinking that I can get behind. But Jeremy Corbyn was just this sort of just complete dogmatic, kind of unshiftable, unrealistic, just figure with no concept of the practicalities of politics. Or I think the other thing is he got into this bubble where he was surrounded by, some quite sycophantic advisors. Seamus Milne, his kind of chief advisor, probably at the top of the line. But also he had this sort of cult of personality around him. And I think that perhaps his supporters and, folks within Labour perhaps didn't see beyond that kind of momentum group, the kind of hardcore Corbyn followers, and just didn't realise that he completely wasn't connecting with the country. And I don't, I spoke to people who were kind of Labour activists and Labour politicians kind of during those years who absolutely got it and who knew they were on the path for a disaster, but the leadership just refused to see it. And the result is that now at Westminster, there's been no effective opposition for years. And with the weakest succession of Conservative governments that I can remember, certainly, there's just been no one able to take advantage of that absolute open goal.
Yeah, and it seems to me that it's a terrible thing to say, but politics is an industry of optics, and politics is an industry of feelings as well as facts, and more so. And Corbyn, what people would tell me, non-Labour supporting friends I've got, is that Corbyn just felt like a geography teacher. He didn't feel like a statesman, and I guess Starmer kind of feels like a statesman, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Corbyn describing him as a geography teacher probably does a disservice to a lot of geography teachers, to be honest. But yeah, Starmer's background is the legal profession. He's used to standing up and he's used to making cases and making persuasive arguments. And I think that's going to serve him a lot better in debates and on TV. I think he's just going to be a much more kind of credible, believable figurehead. And you're right, it does come down to that to a large degree, beyond policies, beyond ideological differences. You put, two people up in front of a camera, and the one who seems sincere and convincing is a huge advantage.
And I've no doubt that Corbyn was a good man, but he was a good man for 1974 as opposed to 2020, right?
Well, I mean, I've got some issues with Corbyn, particularly around his involvement with the Iranian propaganda TV channel in the UK, Press TV. You look at the human rights record of Iran, particularly, my personal concerns about LGBT issues. It shows a huge lack of judgment to involve yourself, financially and to kind of lend support and a degree of credibility to what was essentially their propaganda wing that was eventually banned from broadcast in the UK because of the kind of stances that it put forward. I just think that he wasn't. I think he just showed bad judgment in all sorts of ways, and hopefully now that he's out of the picture, we can get back to having a functional, grown-up opposition.
Viable is the word.
Yes.
Yeah. So sort of moving away from sort of parliamentary politics. So how has the coronavirus affected you as a writer? How has the whole work situation been? Yeah,
it's been really weird. It's I've actually picked up a bit of work because of it. I did a Guardian piece which was about games that you could play in lockdown. I've been doing a little mini-series for Radio Scotland about games. Part of that might be just because they've got a lot of time to fill up and they'll just book anyone these days. But no, it's been interesting. It's been good to just kind of keep getting games in front of that wider audience. And particularly with the radio bits, you're dealing with listeners who really are coming to this absolutely cold, so you can't kind of use any of the sort of language or the terms like you say deck builder or you say area control, and these mean nothing to people who have never, people who haven't spent years absorbing all of this stuff. So it's really about how you break this hobby down, express the theme over the mechanisms, and just kind of try and hopefully hook a few more people in and just grow the community.
And is the board game book more of a sort of gamers thing where you don't need to, have a glossary, or is the intention for that still to be very open to people who aren't familiar with the hobby?
Well, what I hope is that it kind of sits on both sides of the fence. With the first one, we did actually put a literal glossary in the back explaining kind of some of this weird kind of alphabet soup of different terminology. But really, the idea is that if you are new to the hobby, you can maybe start at the front of the book and you've got some of the party games and some of the kind of simpler Euro games. And hopefully, by reading through, you'll see things which maybe pique your interest, kind of drive you to explore a little deeper. So hopefully, it takes casual gamers and makes them slightly less casual. It's kind of a hard thing to do because you're serving two audiences with the book. You need to have the depth and the coverage of the heavier, the more complex, the more niche games, but you obviously need to appeal to a broad audience. But hopefully we've got it right, and hopefully we'll just kind of keep refining it with each new edition that comes out.
So, I mean, with my show, with my writing on games, I just basically get to write what I want and put it out. And if people listen, which few do, then, it's all to the good. As a gamer, do you ever in your work get the opportunity to not have to pass gaming through a sort of filter of new people? Do you have an opportunity to work for certain outlets that let you just write as a gamer talking to gamers?
Yeah, I do regular stuff for Tabletop Gaming Magazine, and that obviously is more of a sort of entrenched, kind of knowledgeable audience. I've also been writing for Senate. I don't know if you know that new publication. And that, again, is very much a sort of gamers magazine, and it's really beautifully produced as well. If anyone listening hasn't seen it, I'd say check it out. But I'm actually getting to do some kind of really deep dives there. For example, the first issue, I did a thing about Viking themes in games that actually got kind of deep into everything from actual board games played by Vikings to kind of different expressions of the theme in modern gaming. And then I've just got the second issue just now where I got to take a dive into colonialism in board games. So not a contentious topic at all there. But yeah, it's interesting.
I did notice that you were having a gripe on Twitter about games got out of my head now. Maracaibo.
Oh, would that have been Maracaibo? Yeah.
Yeah. So if, as a précis for the Senate article, can you sort of give us a brief idea of kind of what your issue is with the sort of representations of colonialism in games?
Well, it's not really my issue. It's sort of something I've become aware of. When you see people who are much more directly affected, either kind of historically or in the present day, by some of the issues that kind of have arisen from the legacy of colonialism, but also just things like misrepresentation of their cultures. So it's a thing about kind of being respectful to the source material that you're drawing from, particularly when, if you're making a game about orcs and dragons, then you're unlikely to offend any orcs or dragons. But if you're making something about kind of Native American cultures, just to pick one example, you have people who have been marginalized and victimized over time. You have kind of continuing economic inequalities as a result of that. And then if you come along and you kind of misrepresent those cultures, it's so easy to take steps to avoid offending people like that. And it just seems to me like if you're going to take the time and the effort to make this game that is kind of mechanically elegant and whatever other has nice artwork, whatever good qualities you want to have in a game, then take the time to actually consult someone and say, okay, is this representation accurate? Is it correct? Is it respectful?
I mean, where do you stand? I don't go back and forth. I've got a very fixed position on this. I mean, I'm willing to be sort of convinced, I guess, if someone could give me a decent argument. But where do you stand on the whole sort of cultural appropriation idea in this? Because it seems to me that what it's boiled down to is a sense of cultural ghettoism, in that if you come from a certain culture, it is now considered a faux pas to try and represent other cultures or take on aspects of other cultures. Do you think culture is a finite resource, and do you think culture should be sort of ring-fenced and protected?
Yeah, I think a lot of nuance has kind of disappeared from these arguments, particularly... Could
be the fact that the main way people... talk about this is in a limit of 280 characters, but
yeah, that's what I was going to say, particularly in the age of Twitter. I mean, to an extent, I think it can be helpful to take a step back and look at the wider context of a situation. And I think that, again, Twitter has led to some quite ideological, blinkered views on a lot of things, not just on issues around, what people call cultural appropriation. To me, the thing is, if you do completely establish kind of cultural silos, then you get rid of a lot of good things that have come from the mixing of cultures. You get rid of rock and roll. You get rid of can you imagine if British cooking was all that was available to people living in the UK? I mean, my God. But I think particularly in terms of kind of representation in games, the thing to me is that, okay, I don't think that people should be banned from making games about samurai, if they're not of Japanese heritage. I think that's a ridiculous idea. I do think that you should take the time to just try and understand a little bit of the historical and cultural context you're working with, and if at all possible, work with someone and pay someone to consult on these things who has some sort of degree of expertise on them.
I mean, this is the point that I've always found an issue with cultural appropriation, because so I think cultural denigration is a very, very common and very dangerous thing. I think it's very easy to say, okay, we have this Orientalist idea about certain cultures, and we'll just represent them how that's always been. And clearly that's not doing your job. But this idea, I was speaking to someone once, and they said they wanted to design a game on Tibetan sand art, but they didn't feel like they could design that game because they're not Tibetan. And that struck me as as taking it too far, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can appreciate things in other cultures, you can find them beautiful, you can find them inspiring, and you can absolutely go and, there's some debate about this, but I would say you can absolutely go and try to represent those in any form of art, But I think that the concept of denigration is an important one. The concept of exploitation is an important one, and I think there is definitely a spectrum between, to take the most egregious example on one end, minstrel shows, and, somebody making a game about Tibetan sand art that they find particularly beautiful. I don't think those two things are comparable, and I think the idea that they are is really quite bizarre.
Yeah, and it's that notion that you can't have, and I think it's because of the Twitter debate. You can't have dreadlocks, or you can't write reggae music or things like this. This idea. I mean, I guess what has always confused me, and I've asked many people and never really got a satisfactory explanation, is that it doesn't seem to me that art is finite. It seems to me that art and good art can be created by everyone in any style. Or am I wrong on that?
I don't think it's for me to say that you're right or wrong on that. I think that's a much wider debate with a lot of people with a lot of different opinions. But I mean, I personally think
But surely you have a view, right?
Yeah, I think that an open, varied cultural exchange can create great things, you're talking about who can make reggae music. Well, look at The Clash, for example, who had reggae influences in a lot of their stuff. And I don't think anyone would argue that they were anything but respectful and appreciative of the culture that music arose from. The blues is the bedrock of rock and roll. It's
right, absolutely. And so, anyway, going off this, we've sort of gone down. It's an interesting side alley, but nevertheless, a side alley. How do you feel this crisis will affect the industry? What have you seen? What sort of trends? And do you think that we're going to see a sort of eradication of the little publisher, and sort of only the people who are big enough to weather the storm will come out at the end?
Not necessarily. I think one of the good things about this industry, if you're a smaller publisher, a self-published designer, is that the entry costs can be quite low. The kind of runs of actual products can be quite low. If you're making 2,000-3,000 games rather than 20,000. I think that there's going to be a demand for entertainment at home for a very long time, and I think that there isn't going to be an immediate lifting of lockdown. I think people are going to be either confined in their homes, or they're going to be reluctant to go out and socialise in a big way. And I think that all forms of at-home entertainment, I've seen anecdotal stuff saying that video game sales have been way up. I can only imagine things like ebooks might have gone the same way. So I think there's going to be opportunities. I'd be interested to see. I know some of the bigger publishers have been making things available as print and play games over the last few months. Even kind of big players like Asmodee have put a lot of stuff out for free for print and play. I've never thought that print and play was going to take off in a big way, but I'd be interested to see if that's changed. I'd be interested to see if I'm proved wrong in that. I think who it's going to be tough for are the brick and mortar retailers. And that's, it's already been a very hard few years for them in terms of competing with online big discounters and Amazon and folks like that. And I think when your whole appeal is that you're the hub of the hobby, that you're a social center, and that's sort of taken away or restricted, I think that's where we're going to see some difficulty.
And do you see that there's going to be a legacy of sort of paranoia, of people not wanting to attend conventions, people not wanting to sort of get together with people? Or do you think that will just evaporate very quickly once lockdown restrictions are removed?
I think it's going to last a while. And it's not going to be a case of one night suddenly all the bars are open. I think that there's two things to bear in mind. One is that there is the need to restrict or postpone social events until it's safe, and then there's going to be the lingering reluctance of people to attend them. And there's also going to be the question of when is it commercially viable for big events like conventions to run again. Because if you're not confident that you're going to get, that you're going to break even on your expenses, then there's no point organising a UK Games Expo or an Essen Spiel or a Tabletop Scotland or a Gen Con or an Origins. So I personally think we could be looking at a period of years. I'd like to be proved wrong on that, but I think it's ultimately going to be down to the medical advice, the science, and people's willingness to go out and engage in social activities again.
So this is slightly off the thing, but as you're a journalist, I think it's a really interesting question. I was speaking to a publisher today, and he basically said he has an issue because he doesn't feel there's any real gaming journalism. And what would you? There are, Senate is one, the Manifold is another. People trying to create journalism around games. As a journalist yourself, what would you like to see happen in gaming journalism in the next 5 years?
Oh, that's a big question to spring on me there, but there are a couple of things. Right, I take exception to your publisher kind of asserting that there's no gaming journalism. I think that a lot of people who are producing kind of gaming, to use a word I hate, content, are driven by their love of the hobby, and they have an innate kind of desire to represent it in a good light, which is understandable. I'd like to see a bit more criticism. I've got a slight issue where people say, I'd like to see more critical games coverage, and then when they get it and someone's critical of a game they really enjoy, then they say, oh, well, you're just being mean for the sake of being mean. That's, but that kind of goes with the territory. You're not going to please everyone. But yeah, I mean, I'd like to see critical discussion, there's this thing that seems to happen in video games where you have people who are so effusively like things so much that you question whether they're entirely independent. And there's this sort of stream of snark on the other side, where people just seem to hate everything to the point where you say, well, do you actually enjoy playing these games? Why are you spending time talking about them? I'd like to see something a bit more balanced and a bit more adult and a bit more considered with the tabletop hobby. And I'd like to think that, with most of the community, that's something that we could achieve. I'd like to see more non-gaming outlets covering games, certainly. Doing stuff for The Guardian, for Radio Scotland has been great. I'd love to see, some of the kind of US newspapers do some kind of serious games coverage. But I'd also like to see a bit more diversity in the kind of pool of people who are talking about games in a public space. And I understand that if you look at some of the abuse people get, that people might not want to kind of put themselves on the firing line for that. But I think that the way that we get better games and the way that we get better games media is to be more representative of the diversity of people who are playing the games. And I think that's something that the industry and games media has sort of lagged behind on for quite a while now.
Do you see there's a motivation issue? Because I'm part of a group on Facebook, which is a sort of it's called the Board Game Reviewers and Media Facebook group, and all I see every time is sort of admins putting up sort of advice posts about how to approach publishers, and then people putting up posts talking about, oh, what should I write to a publisher and blah blah blah. And it seems to me that the motivation seems to be about getting free games, not about providing real criticism, right? Do you see that as an issue?
I don't know. I'm not on Facebook. I don't really participate in those kinds of discussions. I find it a bit of a stretch to imagine that a lot of people would have their kind of integrity bought for, a £30-40 game. But maybe I think you overestimate people quite a lot. Okay, all right. I'm in an unusual kind of position where I get a lot of stuff sent to me on spec anyway, so I don't really have to chase publishers for things. I also think in the UK, because almost everything is distributed between a handful of companies, if you've got a relationship with those distributors, you can get pretty much anything anyway, as long as they've got it in stock. The thing is that a good PR person will realize that providing a free game doesn't guarantee a positive review, and that is a necessary part of gaming media or any kind of cultural journalism. There is no point in having any kind of cultural coverage unless it's independent and trusted, because if your audience doesn't trust you, then why are they going to spend time on you? Why are they going to value your opinion? And when you do say, hey, this is a great game, why will they take that with any degree of importance,
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll get to bump into each other at some convention at some time in the future.
Within a safe 2 meters of each other.
Exactly. Cheers.
All right, thanks.
If you want to support content like this, you can go to patreon.com/5G4D. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, and if you can, stay at home.